All right, thank you. So, welcome again. Welcome from Germany. Good evening, depending on the time zone you are currently in. We're talking about Veeam Hardening Best Practices today. So, we're going to deep dive into some topics. First of all, I'd like to introduce myself for those of you who don't know me. My name is Lukas Klostermann. I'm from Germany, as you already have mentioned, I'm pretty sure. I'm a senior consultant focused on backup and recovery, and I'm also leading the product Veeam for the company I'm working for. And since I think it's December 24, I'm one of 3 VUG leaders for the cybersecurity space. I'm very happy to announce that I've been selected as Veeam Vanguard of the 2025 class. What I do in my daily life is I do Veeam workshops on a technical basis. I do hands-on trainings, and I do security workshops as well, and all the stuff around pre and post sales consulting. I've set up an agenda for today. Basically, I'm aiming to stop around 45 minutes to leave a bit for the Q&A session. So first of all, let's deep dive into the agenda. We talk about general measures. I'd like to present a network security tiering. Then we talked about the specific Veeam Security Tools of 2024 and 2025, so software related. We talk about some technical measures. I'd like to have a word to the Veeam Hardened repository. Let's talk about the Active Directory and application processing in general. Some of you might have noticed that I've been posting recently about Windows Server hardening scripts, so let's dive into that a bit. I'd like to talk about monitoring and auditing as well, and I would like to give a perspective for the user group and for things that are in the queue. We will have a Q&A session, and just for the housekeeping, I'd like you to write down the questions. You can use the chat. One of the security leaders, Mr. Dips, I'm very happy to have him here with me today. He will just monitor the chat and assist when it comes to the Q&A session. So stay tuned. Let me just have a look. Everything's working. Perfect. So let's dive into this. General measures. Basically, I have a golden rule when it comes to disaster recovery. Keep it simple. I don't see any sense in high complex architectures that basically take forever to operate with in case of emergencies. A low RTO approach, in my opinion, begins with a clearly structured and straight to handle runbook. I'm not a huge fan of additional software within concepts, so just keep in mind that you have to operate the systems, you have to work with them in case of an emergency, so keep it simple. Basically, when it comes to physical security, I think all of you know the points. It's just kind of a refresher. We need access control to data centers. We need access monitoring to get transparency in that. You should think about securing server racks and hardware. I think that's nothing new for you. We need fire protection measures because not every attack has to be a virtual one. We need environmental controls like an ambient temperature and humidity sensor and all that stuff. I think we all know that. When it comes to the recovery strategy, we basically have to think about, and that's depending on the organization, we need a clear definition of attack scenarios and vectors, because that might not be the same for every company. We need a clear definition of disaster recovery resources. That's also something that's different for the companies. We need a categorization of workloads. And there are many more measures we have to take to gain a low RTO when it basically comes to disaster. That's the first point. Let's have a look at the architecture. So basically, I'd like to start with a network. Some of you might know network tiering in a security context. So let's roll this up from behind. Let's start with tier 2. What is tier 2? Tier 2 is the network that I call a data network. So the data traffic, the Veeam traffic, with a bandwidth of at least 10 gigabit. This is the network, can be VLAN. We will see that in a minute. I've a Visio prepared. Basically, this is the data transfer network for all the backups. I call this front-end components. So all your repositories, all your proxies, the VBR server, they have to have access to that tier 2 VLAN. The virtual Veeam components like VBR Enterprise Manager, Veeam One, maybe VRO in case you're operating that, they have access to that VLAN. Tier 1. Tier 1 contains all the management ports for general components. Basically, we are talking about out-of-band management. So all your iDRACs, ILOs, and all that stuff for physical, and if you have some, for virtual components as well. Make sure that you separate this from your production infrastructure. Tier 0, so the most critical network, and per definition, the last line of defense, is the management port for Veeam Hardened repositories. So everything that's immutable and air-gapped has to be within that network. And why is that? Because this is the last line of defense. You could think about just cutting cables or just unplugging cables to achieve a high security level. What that means, we'll come to that in a few slides, but this is the last line of defense. As promised, this is an example architecture that I'm trying to follow whenever possible. So let's talk this through. Basically, the blue VLAN, the backup VLAN, is tier 2. So this is the network where the magic happens. So you have data transmission, you have backup data transmission, and all that management traffic from Veeam components to other Veeam components is going through that VLAN. As you might see, the source VMs, in this case, can be Hyper-V, AHV, Nutanix, or vSphere. They're completely separate from that backup networks. And that's very important because you don't want an attacker to have a layer 2 access to your components through a compromised Active Directory or whatever. So make sure that's separate. We need firewalls. We need firewall clusters. That's the best practice, I think, in general for networking components and all that stuff. So you see virtual components like VBR, Veeam One, and the Enterprise Manager, as well as repositories. You see Dell servers as an example. I just forgot to add the blue lines here, but you can imagine 2 blue cables because of redundancy. They're connected to that backup VLAN, tier 2 VLAN. Same for the Veeam Hardened repository, which is in this case in data center C. The front end, and that's why I call it front end, the data ports could be in the same subnet to avoid pumping traffic through the production firewall. Tier 1, in this case, it's yellow or orange. These are all the management components. So the iDRAC of that Dell service. In case that you have tape libraries, dedicated tape libraries, make sure to connect the management ports of the tape libraries to that VLAN. Maybe you can decide, depending on your configuration and the architecture, to connect this to the backup immutable VLAN, to 0 VLAN. So just make sure to connect the components also for monitoring purposes, and this would be the tier 1 VLAN. Last but not least, tier 0. I choose the color red because this is the last line of defense. So it's only for immutable components. That's the idea behind. So you can either unplug the cable or you can make sure that you are, for example, working with unidirectional firewall rules to make sure that nobody has access to that iDRAC, in this case of a Dell server. So this is the last line, and make sure to harden and secure this properly. You also see a component that's called PAW. I'm pretty sure I will mess that up. However, PAW, this is a privileged access workstation. What that is and why that is, Let's get to that in a few minutes. This is just an example. That's my blueprint for a general hardened architecture when it comes to virtualization and on-premise scenarios. The same can be used for example, Azure or AWS. You just have to make sure that the landing zone is properly configured, and this could be a blueprint for that as well. The architecture can be a little bit different because you don't have hypervisor root access, obviously, but basically, this can be a blueprint for cloud environments and hybrid environments as well. The next thing, the Veeam Security Tools, 2024-2025. So I'm talking about the version 12.3. Today, I got the message that 12.3.1 is released, so it's the same, starting with version 12.3. So what do we have? As new features, we have the REST API authentication, OAuth 2.0. That basically means that to receive a token pair, I try to not dive too deep into it, you need a HTTP post request. That is required to receive a token pair in that scenario. We also have, and that's very cool stuff, we have new role-based access control. We have new roles. We have security administrator. What does that do? The security administrator is for adding, changing, and deleting credential objects in Veeam. So you can manage the security analyzer, approve 4i requests. You all know that function, hopefully. So this is a cool and dedicated role for security operations within the VBR infrastructure. We have the incident API operator. So that can be used to perform REST API requests, for example, for malware detection events. This user or this role doesn't have console access. You can use this, for example, for a SIEM integration. Very cool stuff. With all that, you can use a kind of account tiering. Just as we have network tiering, you can use account tiering. Last but not least, this is a very cool and community-driven project. I don't know if you've heard about that, the Veeam decoys. So it's basically an open source community project from the Community Hub that emulates a Veeam environment as a honeypot. So attackers can be, for example, can be used to attack that honeypot. And if you monitor that properly, you may have an advantage because you protect your actual and productive Veeam disaster recovery environment while the time the honeypot gets attacked. That's very cool stuff. Just as an idea, you could, for example, use the API operator role, if you use Sophos or FortiGate, to trigger backups. So just to have an event to trigger backups if there is a malware detection event, something like that. So you can use automation on that. That can help to lower the workload, especially in case of any disaster. Really helpful. The next block, I think many of you know the measures that I will tell you now. So let's deep dive into it. You need, of course, TPM and all that stuff. I think that's nothing new. You also should use dedicated boot devices, and that is to separate OS data from the actual backup data for troubleshooting purposes and all that stuff. You should use the remote desktop protocol, and you should disable SSH, for example, or especially for Veeam Hardened repositories. That's a very important thing. Not only by firewall rules, so please consider disabling the whole service on the target system, and maybe in addition to delete or to disable firewall rules to have a kind of two-layer security. That's very important. You could use anonymized host names in case you want to. Not everybody does, but the idea is to get as close to 100% security as even possible with that ideas and with that concept. You also should think about a PostgreSQL database hardening. Basically, and that's very cool stuff, if you use the Veeam VBR wizard to install the Veeam software, the restriction of connection sources is done by default. What does that mean? There is a config file that's called pg_hba.conf. And in that configuration file, the SSPI authentication, so that's a Windows-based SSO, is used in the way of SSPI mapping. So by default, the service account you use to run the Veeam services has, and I think that's the only one who has access to the Postgre database. And that's very cool because you avoid having a default administrator to have full access to that Postgres database. That's very cool. When we talk about databases, the same level of security should be, in the best case, should be applied to the Microsoft SQL database. So consider hardening that as well. You could restrict the connection sources as well. And you could also think about implementing a kind of role-based access control to not let a default built-in administrator have full access to the Veeam management database in case of Microsoft SQL. All right, another important thing, NTP. You should consider using NTS, and you should consider using public time servers. Why is that? Basically, you want to avoid the manipulation of time servers. And basically, a Google time server is public, but a Google time server is kind of secure. So if you have redundancies like the first NTP server or NTS server is a local firewall, a local domain controller, I don't know, the second tier should be a public time server to have a redundancy and an independent redundancy for the time. That's very important, especially when it comes to immutability. We will come to the Veeam Hardened repository in a minute, so that's kind of very important thing. You should disable or at least restrict the internet connectivity for all the Veeam components, for proxies, repositories, for the VBR server, enterprise manager. You should work with whitelisting and only whitelist the Veeam domains required for update and license checks and all that stuff. You also should use, and that's a feature that's continuously developed and continuously tested, the Veeam Security Analyzer. I see many customers with a lot of like red flags within that security analyzer because they don't know about the function and they don't use the function. Please keep in mind that there is a script that not only analyzes the best practices, there is a community script. No, it's not a community script, it's a public script that executes the recommendations automatically. So very, very easy to handle. You should obviously use the script in the latest version, and the latest version is always implemented into the current software versions of VBR in general. So no worries. You also could use PAWs, Privileged Access Workstations. So that is a component. I recommend not keeping that within the Active Directory domain. That is a component that has access to your disaster recovery components. So this is a single point of admin, a single point of contact for the VBR services, for the components, and for example, I don't know, any disaster recovery data centers based on vSphere, on Hyper-V whatsoever. So this is a single point of monitor, single point of access to all the systems. And when I say single point of anything, it's, I think, obvious that you should think about redundancies as well, because many customers run that PAWs virtually. That's perfectly fine. But in case your production data center goes down, there's a high chance that the PAW goes down with it. So you don't have access to the restore components. And that's something we'd like to avoid. It can be both physical or virtual. Maybe you should have at least one redundancy behind that. And you also should think about specific firewall rules. I wouldn't work with any rules. I would work with like whitelisting, RDP, In case you use RDP, it's not recommended. You can install the Veeam backup console on that and just open the dedicated ports to minimize the attack surface of that systems. I usually work with work group service, so not domain joined, but that's depending on the customer and depending on the company. If you're aiming to get up to 100% security, let's say 98% security, you could use segmentation. So you could deploy a PAW per, for example, per VLAN tier. That's possible, but that's of course a huge workload when it comes to administration, patching, monitoring. But that's basically a recommendation if you want to use and strictly use the security tiers, just like the VLANs. Another thing, and that's a personal recommendation, you should think about the virtualization of Veeam components. So in detail, the VBR server, the Enterprise Manager, Veeam and the VRO server. And why is that? I think every one of us knows virtualization. That's basically load balancing. So it's a performance thing. Redundancy, and you could, please be careful with that, you could use replication. In case of a disaster, we would like to achieve a very low RTO. So we would like to avoid performing a reinstallation of any kind of Veeam software. It's not supported to replicate or back up the Veeam components itself using application-aware processing. So please keep that in mind. I talked to support and they agreed that it's basically possible to, for example, use replication of the components without application-aware processing. Just have that in mind. The current VMCE courses, the trainings, I'm very happy about that. They also recommend virtualizing the components, which is great because you can have load balancing and all that stuff. Why? Or it's just, I think, a better way than using it on physical servers. Avoid reinstallation. You can migrate this to another data center. You can execute disaster plans and all that stuff. So just as a recommendation, I think it should be default by now, in my opinion, backup encryption. Use backup encryption. Use different passwords, for example, per location, per job type, whatsoever. You should monitor the password changes, for example, with Veeam. So attackers could also change encryption passwords for specific jobs or repositories. What happens is that Veeam doesn't throw an error because changing an encryption password is not declared as error. That can be an action performed by an administrator that's intended, but that also can be an attack. So an attacker could change the password, wait until the retention is over, so all the backups are rolled over by new versions, and then you just simply don't have the encryption key for your own backup. So try to avoid that by getting transparency. You also should use personalized accounts. I recommend one Veeam account per employee. And with that, you can use the role-based access control in Veeam. You should use multi-factor authentication in Veeam MFA, and you can consider using 4i authorization. So with that, you can apply the new role-based access control and the new roles we learned about a few minutes ago. There are a few more. You could think about having an administrative account per employee with no rights in Veeam. So the goal is to split the role-based access control in Veeam from the operating system. So only because you have administrative rights to the Windows operating system, that doesn't automatically mean that you should have any rights in the Veeam console. And the other way around, only because you have a restore operator role, that doesn't mean you need administrative rights on the operating system on any component. So make sure to split that. I think that's also part of the the security analyzer, you should perform regular password changes annually or whatever fits, just to make sure that you roll over the passwords. In my opinion, and that's also something we do in Active Directory domains for decades, use service accounts for local services and of course for domain services. I know that the Veeam wizard says that local system is recommended. My personal opinion, it's just my personal opinion. As I said, we're talking about using service accounts in Active Directory for decades, for I don't know how many years. And for every, in modern Active Directory architectures, we use service accounts for every domain service that's present. So I don't see a disadvantage in doing that for local services as well. So I personally always use service accounts, local service accounts for Veeam services to have the ability to change passwords. For those of you who don't know, the local system, the predefined Windows account, has no password. That's a highly privileged account without a password. So at least you have, when you use service accounts, you have a password. That's better than nothing, in my opinion. Another thing, and that's the last topic from the technical measures, use and have available offline documentations for passwords and procedures. Because the best example is you have encryption keys and you have access keys and passwords for your Veeam infrastructure present on your KeyPass on your digital infrastructure. But what if the production infrastructure runs down? It often takes the password safe, the KeyPass down with it. So you don't have access because the system is offline. And to restore the system, you need encryption keys, you need passwords. So make sure to have glass break accounts and encryption keys offline, put it in a safe, and make sure it's available without the production infrastructure. The next topic, you all know that, is the Veeam Hardened repository. In general, you should think about having redundancies, because the Veeam Hardened repository basically is a local server. When we refer to the architecture we just saw a few minutes ago, it's a single server. So in case your data center runs down, in case you have a power outage, in case you have a fire, I don't know, make sure you have redundancies. So you can either deploy multiple VHRs, or you could also use cloud backups with immutability. I wrote preferred behind that. And why is that? You have a very great scalability with cloud systems that can, for example, be the Veeam Data Cloud, Veeam Data Vault, whatsoever. Make sure to have or to keep in mind that you should have redundancies when it comes to immutability, because immutability is one way to recover, to being able to recover from ransomware attacks. And I think that's a very, very high attack surface we have currently. As I already said, the last line of defense is the IPMI, or the out-of-band management. So make sure to separate this, put it in another VLAN, put it in a dedicated VLAN, or just unplug the cable after, of course, configuring this and make sure all that works. I don't know if you visited the VeeamON 2024. Hannes told us something about the Veeam Hardened repository when just right before the ISO, the first ISO version was released. There will be, at least it's on the roadmap as far as I remember, there will be monitoring mechanisms on the operating system. So it might be possible in the future that we don't need the out-of-band management for a basic monitoring. So that's good stuff. As I said, make sure that you have a physical connection and you can protect this using unidirectional firewall rules. Or you could use, maybe that's part of an ISO in the future, you can use alternative ways to monitor the server. When we come to the VHR ESO, the ISO, make sure you use it. Oh, thank you. Make sure you use this. And why is that? Because basically the standardization we have using that ISO improves the support. It improves the support and makes things quicker in case of an emergency. And that's another good thing, the use of actual hardware is required. And that's important because if you run the Veeam Hardened repository on a virtual machine, I did that in the past, only for testing purposes, of course, you have another layer behind that. And the last line of defense might switch over to your hypervisor. And that's something you don't want because a hypervisor is also in the target of attackers. So make sure to use hardware that is supported. Another thing we have to talk about is the application integration. So AAP, especially Active Directory, is a huge thing. You can use GMSA, Group Managed Service Accounts. If you can't use GMSA, or if the customer doesn't want to use GMSA, you could use service account tiering. So just as network tiering, there is obviously Active Directory tiering. So make sure to have service accounts ready and appropriate tier. That's very important. Just a disclaimer, GMSA don't work for on-premise Exchange environments. So that's not supported. The proxies that you use when you want to use GMSA, they have to be domain joined. All the other Veeam components, the VBR server, the repository, proxy server, whatsoever, they shouldn't be in the production Active Directory domain. If you have a management domain, it could be a way to use that, but basically it has to be kept away from the productive Active Directory. I don't want to dive too deep into that, but you could think about modifying your Kerberos configuration. You can restrict the delegation. So for example, you could use with the predefined group protected users. You could use authentication with SPN. Basically, you need a unique identifier for a service with Kerberos. I think we could, maybe if you have questions regarding that, I think Dibs can explain it way more better than I can. You can configure the ticket lifespan within the Active Directory. You have to keep in mind that this may affect services because not every service can be using a ticket lifetime that's below the default. The default should be 12 hours, I think. And if you reduce this, not every application welcomes this. So just keep that in mind. You should avoid Kerberoasting. Basically, Kerberoasting is an attack based on a password hash. I think there are not many ways to avoid that. You can, for example, roll over the password more often. So for example, I think the current recommendation should be between 30 and 60 days, which is, I think, a very short time frame. But anyways, that's a kind of effective way to avoid that. You also should avoid, when it comes to service accounting, token bloat. You can do that using GPOs or the registry. What is token bloat? Basically, if you have a service account or an Active Directory account in general, that's a member of too many Active Directory groups, then there is a token size. I think the default is 20,000 bytes in current domains. And if you blow that token size, that can lead to errors because not every group might be applied. That can be a risk if you use too many groups for service accounts, which may be required. So think about that and keep that in mind. And this is my favorite topic because I spend really a huge amount of time in that: Windows Server hardening according to CIS guidelines. So I saw the challenge that currently, and that will change in the future, as we all hopefully all know, currently Veeam software is mainly, so the main components like VBR, they are running on Windows Server or Windows OS in general. What does that mean? So basically we have to think about, what does Microsoft do? They deploy servers and they ship out server operating systems that have no hardening at all, in my opinion. So we should think about having standards and basics we apply to servers who we like to run in disaster recovery environments. A few things. Disable the local or the built-in administrator. Why is that? Because the built-in administrator has a well-known SID. The SID is 500. I know that, you know that, so basically the attacker knows that as well. Just create a new administrator and make sure to, for example, use personalization on that. You can assign personal administrators and create personal administrators to all your administrators, to all the employees, depending on your structure. You also should think about modifying the local security policy. So, for example, remove the local administrator group from the RDP access, the remote desktop protocol access. Basically, if you, I don't know if you're familiar with that, if you open the local security policy and you see a topic called allow remote desktop access, something like that, or grant remote desktop access. By default, when you clean install the Windows operating system, there's basically administrators and remote desktop users. The administrators group has the built-in administrator as a member, obviously, and the remote desktop users group is empty. So it's a nice thought of Microsoft to predefine the group, but it does make sense because the group is empty. So make sure to remove the administrators from that policy. You can think about a second layer. So you can think about denying the RDP access to the local admins, not only the predefined admin, to all the local administrators. So it's a kind of second layer to deny the access. You also should deny the run as a service right for the predefined and also all the local administrators, because it's not the purpose of the local administrators to run services. And if an attacker, for example, gets access, however he does that, to an administrator, he will try to run services, or it's very likely that he will to talk to any kind of CNC server whatsoever. So make sure to deny run as a service for that account. And basically the same is the other way around for service accounts, local service accounts. They don't need RDP access, so make sure to block the RDP access only for that accounts. If you want to, you can work with Windows firewall zones. So you could restrict specific IPs and zones. You can, for example, only let traffic through when it comes from a specific subnet. So you can add your production subnets, whatsoever, your DMZ to that, depending on the architecture. You can also remove unneeded objects, and just as a spoiler alert, when you do Windows update, it's very likely that these deleted objects like Xbox Game Center, when we come to Windows Server 2016, they will come back, but you could maybe just delete them again. That's just a general recommendation. I previously said that I'm not a huge fan of adding additional or third-party software to Veeam components. Let me break that rule really quick, because we have an idea. Multi-factor on Windows OS level. Those of you who might follow me in the community app, they might have seen my post about Cisco Duo on Windows. I had a customer, a really huge customer here in Germany, who had the idea to add a second layer of authentication to Windows, because they do have like 60 off-branch locations. So they have physical VBR servers. It's like an all-in-one installation per location. So basically they needed a second layer to harden the OS. And that was, in this case, Cisco Duo. I knew the software and I ran some tests. So this could be an idea to prevent unwanted access on the OS level. Basically, whatever solution you're using, you have to ensure the offline capability, because if you remember, we don't want internet access on the components. Another thing is you should use, I already said that, local service accounts for Veeam services. Avoid using local system. And in general, there are a few Windows services that can and should be disabled. And some of them will be disabled if you run the Veeam Security Analyzer script. The print spooler is not part of the script yet. Maybe we'll see that in the future. You should disable the remote registry. You should disable the remote PowerShell. There are many, many additional ways and additional policies to harden Windows OS. I tried to make things easier and tried to make our life easier by creating a script. I just held this presentation in Munich back in November. I think it was November 2024. It was also a user group event, and I told them, hey, it's no problem. I will just quickly run a script or write a script to run or to apply CIS-based policies. The script ended up being more than 1,200 lines big. So basically, there are around 100 policies, I think. I can't recommend to anyone to manually go into the local GPO editor and just run through that. That takes a huge amount of time. I tried to do this, and after I think 6 days, I just throw that away and focused on the script again. So it can be an approach to, of course, on your own risk. Please keep that in mind, to run a script or to write an own script for the policies you like to use. Just feel free to check it out. It's on the cybersecurity space. And the next topic, one of the last topics I want to talk about, and it's a very important thing, is monitoring and auditing. What does that mean? An aim is to get transparency. So the first thing, and this is also an immutability thing, you would like to get information and transparency when it comes to time shifts. So monitor that. Make sure you see if the time on a server changes. That's not only because an immutability feature might be disabled or might be outlawed. You have to think the following scenario. An attacker gets access to your system. An attacker changes the time because he has the rights to do so, manipulates the system, performs some changes, don't know, and changes the time back again. So you might have really big trouble to find out the exact timestamp of what was done, and you can't recreate the steps of the attacker, which is also, when it comes to RTO, a very, very big handicap in my opinion. You also should think about monitoring Windows logons. So local logons and RDP logons in case you're using remote desktop. There are event IDs I've written down into the presentation for failed logons and successful logons. So maybe you should, don't know if you use PRTG or any other tool, you could think about creating rules that throw an alarm when a logon takes place. And it could be part of a script to pause or disable that sensor temporarily when you want to maintain the system. So you need a runbook in any case. Same is, of course, for Linux systems, also failed logons, successful logons. That's quite important. And you should monitor inactive sessions, because inactive sessions, when it comes to Microsoft Windows operating systems, they're very easy to overtake. That applies to all components. Next thing, service monitoring. So you should think about monitoring the process creation, because in a productive Veeam environment, there are no processes, as far as I know, that will be created automatically. So make sure to get an information, to get an alert when a new process is created that can be unwanted. When a new service is installed, same procedure. When a startup type is changed, because it can be an attack scenario to just put the Veeam services to manual start and let the administrator reboot the server when it comes to maintenance, and then you won't see the Veeam services coming back. So make sure you monitor the startup type change. You can monitor Veeam jobs. You can use specific event IDs to monitor failed Veeam jobs, and also, if you like to, successful Veeam jobs. You also can use the event ID 1501 to monitor license issues in Veeam. It's also very important in case you don't have or don't want to use email notifications. You could also monitor group memberships. That can be done both on local systems and on Active Directory systems. So in case you're using a management domain for Veeam that doesn't have to apply to the Veeam role-based access control, but to the Windows OS access, for example, you can use monitoring of any Veeam admin group you might have. Same for the productive Active Directory domain. So make sure you monitor the domain admin group, and obviously also all the other groups within the Active Directory. So make sure you have transparency and get information about changes both in the production environment and in the disaster recovery environment. When we come to the perspective, because this is a kind of brief overview about the general measures and ideas you can quickly implement. You can deep dive into that more in detail. We have an hour, so basically, when we come to Q&A, I would like to give a perspective. I will commit myself, as long as Veeam doesn't 100% run on Linux, to optimize and continuously develop the Windows hardening script. So I'm currently waiting for the CIS policies for Windows Server 2025 to edit the script one more time, and it could be an idea to keep the flow on the community project to develop this. As we all know, and we all do, we have cybersecurity space user group, and the content in general obviously will be continuously updated. We have a new leader team, which is Tobias Gregorios, Dibbs, and me. So basically, we'll try to create some events, virtual events, obviously, because we are all around the globe. So there will be cybersecurity events, meetups. We'll come to that, I think, in a few weeks. And basically, this presentation will also be shared within that user group, together with all the other content, scripts, and ideas that you guys might have. So please feel free to post content into that group and to give feedback, to ask for feedback, and to publish your ideas, because I think as a community, it's very important to exchange experiences, especially when it comes to security and hardening, because I think there is no black and white blueprint when it comes to that, because every customer, every environment has own capabilities, has own requirements, and a very unique situation. So please make sure to use every aspect on your own risk, do your research, and yes, with that, the main part of the presentation is over, and we are coming to the Q&A session. And I will just fire up my GoToMeeting window. So Dibbs, if you would like to, you can unmute yourself. Basically, you should have the rights to do so. And let me pull up the chat to see what kind of questions we have. And I see a lot of stuff from Dibbs. So in case that you have questions that are still unanswered, maybe it would be great if you can post them again, that I can see them at the bottom of the page. Let's give this a minute or two. A question: if a customer have two site with the edge interconnection, Antonio, that's a great question. So basically, you have to, in my opinion, you have different approaches. The first approach could be to not separate the VLANs in case that you have hardened and separated the VLANs in both environments. So if you have a remote site and a local site, and you can make sure that the VLAN is secured on both locations, it could be an idea to not separate them, because that makes data handling a lot easier. And in case you would like to separate them, you basically have to work with a VPN. And when you work with a VPN, I think you most likely work with a firewall. You can use firewalls to split the traffic, but keep in mind that the data, the productive data, when it comes to backup and replication traffic, will go through that link. Can be a firewall, can be a VPN gateway, whatsoever. Does that answer the question? Is that all right? All right, big head up for using NTP. Oh, dips, it's all good. NTP. Oh, that's a good point. Yes, NTP is also very, very important when it comes to MFA. That's a very good point, because there are, of course, dependencies to NTP or NTS for MFA. Same as for the basic installation of Cisco Duo, by the way. That's a good point. Thank you. More questions? Let's give it a minute or two. We have 3 minutes left. It's a perfect timing. Very pleased with that. All right, I will come to that in a minute. I don't see any questions that haven't already been answered by Divs, so thank you very much again for that. Let's come to an end. I don't want to spend more time than I need to. I would like to thank you very much for your attention, and I just thrown up some QR codes. So please make sure that you check out the cybersecurity space for the upcoming events and for on-demand events, as this is one of them. So in case you want to know anything in particular, just feel free to reach out to Tobias, to Dibs, to myself. So just feel free to consume all the content. And with that, let's come to an end. Thank you very much, and have a great evening, have a great day, depending on the time zone, and see you next time.